The rain had not stopped for days. Mud clung to boots, to stretchers, to the bandages already soaked through with blood. Inside the small infirmary, once a schoolhouse, German nurses heard the steady groan of trucks arriving. The war was collapsing around them. The Rhine was breached, Allied forces pressing eastward. And now, the wounded came in endless waves. The first stretchers carried German soldiers, faces pale and hollow from weeks of retreat. Some were barely more than boys, pulled from classrooms into uniforms too large. Others were veterans from the Eastern Front, their eyes fixed in a distant stare, as though nothing could surprise them anymore. The air was heavy with iodine, gunpowder, and damp clothing. Nurses worked quickly, cutting away boots swollen tight around shrapnel wounds, trying to keep order in chaos. Then came the twist. Mixed among the German casualties were prisoners, Americans and British taken in the confusion of earlier battles. The nurses had been told to expect hostility, to be ready for anger or violence. Instead, the silence was worse. The captured soldiers said little, their pain expressed only in clenched jaws and muffled cries. According to one nurse's later diary, "We expected hatred. What came instead was exhaustion. They looked as if they had marched through fire itself." The infirmary itself was collapsing under pressure. Medical supplies had been nearly drained. Cotton was scarce. Ether and morphine were rationed to drops. Nurses cut strips from old linen curtains to make bandages. A broken school desk served as an operating table. The building shook each night with the rumble of Allied artillery in the distance, the walls trembling as plaster dust fell into the corners. Among the wounded was a young American private with a chest wound. He was placed next to a German sergeant who had lost an arm. The two men, enemies by uniform, lay side by side. Eyewitnesses recalled how the nurse treating them whispered a prayer in German as she cleaned their wounds, not caring which soldier it reached. The war had reduced them both to fragile, shivering bodies on borrowed time. In the courtyard, more civilians gathered, women, children, and old men from nearby villages, some injured by air raids, others fleeing the front. Their arrival unsettled the staff. The infirmary was meant for soldiers, yet the lines between soldier and civilian had blurred beyond recognition. A boy with burns from an air attack whimpered as he was laid on the floor. His cries echoed louder than the wounded men's silence. Every few hours, more trucks arrived. Some carried men already dead, wrapped in blankets, left outside against the wall because there was no room. Nurses carried lanterns into the dark, searching faces for signs of life. One recalled in a letter found after the war, "We did not choose between German or foreigner. We chose only between the living and the dead." By late March, the infirmary was overflowing. The sound of boots in the hallway never stopped. The wounded arrived faster than they could be treated. Food rations dwindled to thin soup. The nurses worked until their hands blistered, their aprons stained with layers of blood that never fully washed out. Yet what struck them most was not the endless stream of German casualties, but the moment when the so-called enemy arrived under the same roof. Night fell with no clear line between friend and foe. Only the dim light of oil lamps flickered over rows of bodies, each breathing shallowly, each fighting for one more hour. Outside, the artillery thundered closer. Inside, the question lingered. In this room of broken men, did uniforms matter anymore? The windows rattled with every distant blast. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams of the old schoolhouse. Inside, rows of cots stretched wall to wall, each filled with wounded men. The infirmary was full, yet more stretchers kept coming through the door. Nurses whispered to each other in clipped tones, their voices tense. The sound of artillery rolled closer each night, and no one inside believed the walls could hold forever. The school desks had been pushed against the windows, serving as barricades against flying glass. Blackout curtains hung in tatters. In what had once been a classroom, a surgeon bent over a patient with only a kerosene lamp for light. The air reeked of sweat, iodine, and unwashed bodies. A nurse soaked a rag in cold water and pressed it against the soldier's forehead. Morphine was gone, ether nearly gone. "Hold him," the doctor ordered. Two orderlies gripped the man's arms while the blade bit into his flesh. According to a recovered letter, one nurse described the scene as a place of learning turned into a place of dying. Chalk still marked the blackboard behind her, an unfinished arithmetic lesson, half erased but visible under the dim lamp glow. The room smelled faintly of chalk, dust beneath the stench of wounds. It was a cruel reminder that only months earlier, children had sat where the wounded now lay. The war outside pressed in with every breath. Food was rationed to watery soup, often stretched with potatoes that had begun to rot. Nurses boiled them anyway, straining the mold, knowing there was no choice. Patients groaned with hunger as much as pain. One diary entry from a German corporal noted, "We are fed like ghosts. My stomach cries louder than the guns." Yet still, the staff ladled out what little they had, serving enemy and countrymen alike. At night, the infirmary shook with the roar of Allied bombers. The patients stared upward at the ceiling as if it might crack open. Nurses moved quickly to calm them, though they were just as afraid. In one raid, shrapnel tore through the roof, slicing into a cot. The soldier lying there died instantly, his blood soaking into the school's wooden floorboards. By morning, the cot was gone, but the stain remained, a dark patch underfoot. Whispers of spies and collaborators haunted the halls. Some German officers suspected the nurses of being too merciful toward Allied prisoners. A rumor spread that one had smuggled bread to an American. Fear of betrayal grew alongside the fear of bombs. Every act of compassion carried risk. Still, small gestures continued. A bandage wrapped tighter, a cup of water passed to trembling lips, a prayer whispered over a stranger. The infirmary itself became a battlefield of the unseen, not of bullets and shells, but of willpower, hunger, and suspicion. Each day, more wounded arrived than departed. Each day, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Nurses wrote hurried notes in their journals, unsure if anyone would ever read them. One line, found after the war, captured the mood. "We are waiting, always waiting. For supplies. For orders. For the end. For something." By late March, the sound of artillery was no longer distant. It was at the doorstep. The infirmary's lamps flickered with each concussive wave. Patients clutched their blankets. Nurses steadied their hands. No one knew if the next shell would strike the schoolhouse itself. The building stood in silence, trembling under the weight of war, every man and woman inside listening for the final blast. The door creaked open, and the scent struck first. Not iodine, not blood, not smoke. It was sweet, fresh. The smell of spring flowers carried into a place that had forgotten color. German nurses, their hands raw from endless work, froze where they stood. A handful of American civilians, women mostly, a few older men, stepped hesitantly into the infirmary. In their arms, they carried bundles of lilacs, tulips, and early roses, cut from gardens spared by the fighting. For weeks the staff had braced for cruelty. The Allied advance had been relentless, the bombing merciless. Many expected reprisals against anyone wearing a German uniform, even a nurse's apron. Yet here, in the crowded hall of a schoolhouse-turned-hospital, there was only silence as the civilians moved down the rows of cots. Their flowers looked almost absurd among the pale faces, the torn uniforms, the dark stains on the floor. According to an entry later found in a nurse's diary, we believed they would spit at us, perhaps strike us. Instead, they laid blossoms beside the wounded, and the room grew still, as if the war itself paused. One soldier, barely 17, clutched a tulip in his trembling hand. Another, an American prisoner lying next to him, smiled faintly at the sight, then closed his eyes. The act unsettled everyone present. German orderlies exchanged wary looks. Some feared a trick, an insult disguised as kindness. Yet the flowers were real, their petals bright against the dull gray of the room. They carried no hidden message, no propaganda. Just life, fragile and impossible to explain. A nurse whispered to another, "They bring flowers to men who may not live another day." The civilians spoke little. One woman bent down to place a cluster of lilacs by a German sergeant who had lost his arm. He tried to sit up, but the effort was too much. She only touched his shoulder lightly before moving on. Another villager left a single rose in the hands of an unconscious boy whose bandages were still damp with blood. The nurses, hardened by months of shortages and suspicion, found themselves blinking back tears they hadn't allowed for their own countrymen. Then came the twist. A nurse reported that an American civilian crossed the room to the cot of a captured American soldier, one of their own. Instead of greeting him first, she placed flowers on the chest of the German beside him. Eyewitnesses recalled the wounded American murmuring through cracked lips, "It's right." That moment stunned the room more than anything else. The flowers did not heal. They did not feed empty stomachs or close wounds. Yet their presence shifted the air. For the first time in months, the smell of spring overtook the smell of death. According to field notes collected after the war, several patients, German and Allied alike, requested that the flowers remain on their cots until they wilted. They wanted to see them, to smell them, to remember them. By dusk, the civilians had gone, leaving behind only the blossoms. Nurses moved quietly between the cots, adjusting blankets, refilling cups of water, now under the watch of roses and lilacs instead of only shadows. One nurse wrote that night, "The flowers will die soon. But until then, we keep them here." Proof that even at the end, life did not vanish completely. When the lamps were turned low, the infirmary looked almost peaceful. A field of wounded men lay beneath flickering light, each with a small piece of spring resting on his chest. Outside, the guns still thundered. But inside, for a moment, the war seemed far away. The guns still roared in the distance when the testimonies began. Inside the infirmary, men too weak to lift their heads whispered their memories to nurses, who in turn wrote hurried lines into diaries. The war was collapsing around them, but what stayed fixed in their minds was not the thunder of artillery. It was the flowers, the hands that delivered them, the impossible image of enemy civilians offering mercy to broken men in gray uniforms. One German private, his leg bandaged from hip to ankle, told a fellow patient that he had never seen such a thing. "We were told they hated us. Yet they brought lilacs." His words were recorded in the margins of another soldier's notebook, smudged in pencil, almost unreadable. Another entry, later recovered by Allied investigators, described a nurse's astonishment. "They gave to our wounded first, before their own countrymen. I cannot explain it. It is beyond rules, beyond war." For months, propaganda had shaped every thought inside Germany. Posters painted the Allies as ruthless, bent on destruction. Soldiers were taught that capture meant humiliation or death. Yet here was living proof that kindness had crossed the battle lines. Nurses passed the story from cot to cot, as if repeating it would make it real. Some called it a trick of mercy, others a miracle. But the effect was the same. The room seemed lighter, if only for a night. Then came a darker realization. The flowers would wither. Already, petals had begun to curl, their edges browned from the heat of the lamps. Patients who clutched them feared that when the blossoms died, so would the memory. One nurse scribbled in her diary, "We try to keep them alive in water jars, but water is scarce. They will not last. Yet men cry when we move them." Even in collapse, something fragile had to be protected. Eyewitness accounts also revealed divisions. Some German officers frowned upon the gesture, calling it weakness, even danger. To them, such acts blurred the lines of loyalty. They warned nurses not to become soft with prisoners or civilians. But the warnings carried little force in a room where suffering had erased uniforms. One nurse later testified, "The command still demanded hate. But hate could not live beside flowers." Among the most striking testimonies came from Allied prisoners themselves. One American corporal, recorded in a post-war interview, remembered lying beside a wounded German when the flowers were placed between them. "I thought she would choose me," he said, "but she gave them to him first. I was glad for it. We were both dying the same way." His words echoed the quiet truth that propaganda had tried to bury, that pain was universal, and mercy had no uniform. Day by day, survivors wrote what they could. Some carved lines into scraps of paper. Others etched words onto the back of supply labels, knowing full well they might never be read. Yet their voices carried a rare note of clarity amid confusion. They spoke not of victory or defeat, but of the shock of being treated as human. As one diary fragment read, "It was not the end of the war we remembered. It was the flowers." When night fell, the infirmary returned to silence. Lamps flickered low, and the blossoms stood in jars, petals drooping, their scent fading. Men watched them in the dark, holding on as if the flowers were proof that even in ruin, mercy had taken root. Outside, the guns pounded closer. Inside, fragile voices asked the same question. Would the memory of kindness survive longer than the petals? The church bells rang on May 8th, but they did not sound like victory here. The war had ended, Germany defeated, yet the village near the Rhine lay in ruins. Houses were gutted, streets littered with rubble, the air still thick with the smoke of recent bombardment. Inside the infirmary, silence hung heavier than any explosion. The guns had stopped, but the men in the cots still groaned, still clutched bandages, still fought for breath. For them, surrender meant nothing. The German nurses stood at their posts, uniforms frayed and stained, unsure of what would come next. Some feared arrest. Others feared being cast aside once the last patient died. Allied troops now passed openly through the streets. Their boots struck hard against the stones, a reminder of the new order. The nurses braced for punishment. Instead, they saw a different response: American soldiers helping civilians carry water, sharing rations with children who lined up barefoot at the gates. It was not the revenge many had expected, yet the memories of April lingered more powerfully than the arrival of peace. Those flowers, already wilted, some now pressed between the pages of hidden journals, had come to symbolize something no treaty could dictate. A nurse later confessed in testimony, "The blossoms lasted only days. But even when they browned, we kept them. They reminded us that the world was not entirely destroyed." For the wounded, the memory of that gesture became a kind of anchor. A former soldier recalled years later that he had kept a petal from a tulip handed to him in that infirmary. He carried it folded inside a ration slip long after the war was over. "It was not medicine," he said, "but it kept me alive in my thoughts." His testimony, preserved in post-war interviews, revealed the strange truth. Amid the collapse of armies and nations, it was the smallest, most fragile things that endured in memory. The burden of remembering was heavy. For German nurses, writing down what they had seen was a risk. Any expression of sympathy for the enemy could be judged as betrayal. Some destroyed their diaries after the war, tearing pages, burning scraps. Others hid them, knowing one day the words might explain what the propaganda never had: that mercy could exist even in defeat. "I kept one pressed flower," a nurse admitted decades later. "I could not throw it away. It was proof of a moment when we were treated as human." For civilians, too, the act carried weight. American villagers who had crossed into the infirmary often stayed silent afterward. Some feared being accused of aiding the enemy. Others simply could not explain why they had done it. But archival notes record a simple phrase repeated by several: "We brought flowers because they were men, not uniforms." When the war ended, graves were dug in fields, marked with wooden crosses. Some of those graves, German and Allied alike, still bore petals placed there by anonymous hands. The infirmary itself emptied slowly, its walls scarred by shrapnel, its floors stained by months of suffering. The chalkboard in the classroom, still faintly marked with arithmetic lessons, was finally erased. But the memory of that spring could not be wiped away so easily. As the village rebuilt, as soldiers went home or remained in foreign soil, one haunting image persisted in testimony after testimony: rows of wounded men lying in silence, each with a flower on his chest. Outside, the world had been collapsing. Inside, for a brief moment, something fragile had survived. The question that lingered, unspoken but heavy, was whether humanity could carry that memory forward, or whether it would fade, like petals scattered by the wind.